Gentlemen, oh, I do like a sport montage, don't you? Gets us all ready, gets us all psyched for the day. What a few years it's been. It's been a while since we've had all of you back in the room. But welcome along to the Sport Resolutions Conference 2022. Yes, that is the year. We haven't been here for a while. I think I've had this date in the diary since 2019. One or two things happened since then. I can't quite remember what. But here we are, and a very warm welcome to all of you and to our delegates today. I'm very excited to hear from some of our guests who are going to be discussing some really fascinating topics. We are so fortunate to have some of the most illustrious and exciting voices in sport, sports law, sports medicine and science with us here today. I think you'll all agree this is a world-class lineup. I know we're going to give us their analysis and their insight and hopefully a little bit of lively debate. I heard somebody say backstage there they're going to throw some bombs on the stage. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I'm looking forward to it. Today, though, ladies and gentlemen, is also about you. We want to hear from you. I know we've got a very insightful audience along with us, and with the medium of technology, throughout today's event, I would like to hear your questions. So if you could just use the hashtag on Twitter, that's probably the simplest way. Hashtag SportRes2022, hashtag SportRes2022, or you can at me on Twitter as well. You don't have to wait for the topics to come up, just keep tweeting them throughout the day and we'll put them to our panel. I should say a very special welcome to our sponsor, Winston Strawn once again for their 6th year, would you believe? Couldn't keep away. I know some of you here have attended this conference before. You may have noticed that we have extended the number of topics to 6 this year, and for good reason. There's a lot to talk about, I think you'll agree. We're going to start things off with session 1, which is basically a review of the 2021 Anti-World Doping Code. Now this, of course, was introduced at the beginning of last year. I know that for myself, we've seen a lot of repercussions for this quite quickly. The spotlight, of course, has been on the use of recreational drugs from athletes and on punishments. Well, more on that in just a moment. We've had a quick chat about that backstage there, and there's a lot to talk about, let me tell you. Session 2, it's again a phrase that's used seemingly daily now within the media. It is sports washing, a huge topic. A lot of discussion around a time where there are a lot of sensitivities around major events where they're being staged, and you know what thought has been given to the human rights record of those countries. And how much that is really taken into account and whether or not that will change. But thankfully, David Grevenberg will be giving his insight on this. Session 3, and I think this again will spark a pretty lively and impassioned discussion. This one is pregnancy and sports. You know, we think about the rigorous training cycles that athletes have to endure, alongside the challenges of fertility and timing. The fact that women then have to be concerned with losing funding, losing sponsorship, it's a huge topic. And again, the big question will be if a woman is physically able to compete after having a child, and why do we constantly talk about the fact that they can't? Why is that the perception? Session 4, ladies and gentlemen, if you do not know what an NFT is, you are not alone. Bit of a murmur there, don't panic. Alex Tell will be here to clear things up, explain what the legal implications of, hang on, I get this right, non-fungible tokens are. I promise I will know what that is by the end of the day. The purpose then of session 5, it's really to go through the science with a DSD athlete and a transgender athlete. I know that this is a really emotive issue. It raises a lot of questions. So I suppose this is a good time again to remind you, please, to think of any questions that you might have. We've got somebody here who can hopefully address any questions you've got. Dr. Alan Williams, a big issue once again. So hashtag SportRes2022 to get your questions in. As I say, don't wait until the topic, get them in as quickly as you can. Finally, again, an industry that's growing at an exponential rate. It is impossible to ignore, especially if you follow Jesse Lingard on Twitter. I am talking about esports. It's a multi-billion-pound industry now. And we will have the Commonwealth Games set to introduce the Esports Championships later this year. We're seeing the first Olympic virtual series in Tokyo already. And it raises a big question though. Who is regulating it? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Andrew Nixon will be here to answer your questions again. It's a busy day, I think you'll agree. I think you don't want to hear too much from me, you want to hear from our esteemed panels. There will be some time too for lunch and teas, you'll be happy to know. I know you've all been getting to chat, it's a long time since we've all been together, and we'll continue the conversation over lunch. For now though, I would like to ask the Chief Executive of Sport Resolutions, Richard Harry, to come up and say a few words. I'll see you later.
Take that photograph. I was taken about 10 years ago. Anyway, good morning everybody. It really is my pleasure to welcome you to the Sport Resolutions Annual Conference for 2022. As Holly's alluded to, this is the first since 2019. 1997 saw the establishment of Sport Resolutions 25 years ago. So it's a bit of a milestone birthday for us. So what I'm going to take the opportunity to do is to take you through our journey from our early years to now. Self-indulgent, I know, but I just want to take this opportunity to perhaps tell people a bit more about us. It all started in 1994, actually, when one of our best middle distance runners at the time was unceremoniously pulled from the Commonwealth Games in Canada on the basis that she was alleged to have returned an anti-doping rule violation from a sample she gave in Lisbon sometime prior to that event. Diane protested her innocence, indicating that she would never cheat. To cut a long story short, she spent a lot of time and indeed money to clear her name, proving in fact that the sample that she gave was left on a windowsill in the Lisbon laboratory in around 35 degrees of heat. Perhaps unwisely, though, Diane decided that she would pursue civil action against the British Athletics Federation as was, which sadly she failed, resulting in her bankruptcy and the demise of the British Athletics Federation as was. Why is this relevant? You may be thinking, well, 9 major stakeholders within British sport at the time decided that there should be an alternative and a better way for disputes to be resolved within sport. Now is my test to try and remember the 9 family members. Here we go. The British Olympic Association, British Paralympic Association, and the Sport and Recreation Alliance, Professional Players Federation, British Athletes Commission, European Sponsorship Association, Sports Associations of Wales and Scotland, and the Northern Ireland Sports Forum, round of applause for me remembering, please, all came together to set up Sport Resolutions. It was visionary, but I think the sport wasn't quite ready for Sport Resolutions at that time. In respect of our first home, I'm told it was at the very back of the offices of the CCPR, or Sport and Recreation Alliance as it is. We then moved to a service office in Fleet Street, then to 1 Salisbury Square, and now to our shiny new gaff at 1 Paternoster Lane. But our early directors contain an alumni of some significant people that many of you will know. It's invidious to pick certain individuals, but I shall do so anyway. Dame Di Ellis, the late Dame Di Ellis, I would add, Nick Howard, Karina Fleck, Johnny Searle, Sarah Sutcliffe, Trevor Watkins, to name but a few. And we've also been blessed with some equally heavyweight chairmen, starting with Charles Woodhouse through to Gerard Elias, Peter Crystal, Edwin Glasgow, and now Audley Shepherd. But equally, I think it's right and proper to recognise and thank UK Sport for their continued funding throughout. I've looked through the records from the early years, and I think it's fair to say that we did nowhere near the volume of work then that we certainly do now. But notwithstanding that, UK Sport continued to support Sport Resolutions through those early challenging times, and it's quite right and proper, I think, to reflect that and to thank UK Sport publicly. Let's talk about where we are now. In the recent review of Australia's sport integrity arrangements, Sport Resolutions was described thus: one of the most successful and well-regarded sports arbitration agencies globally. Domestically, we've run the National Anti-Doping Panel via a contract with DCMS since 2007, and we formed the National Safeguarding Panel for Sport in 2013. Some of the sports and bodies for whom we provide services in this country include Sport England, UK Sport, the Football Association, Premier Rugby, Lawn Tennis, UK Athletics, the RFU, the WRU, and so on. But excitingly, in these last 12 months, and in the one example this very week, we are also, I think, at the forefront of pioneering really innovative schemes and programs to assist sport to better govern itself. The first is in relation to Sport England funded project, which is the Safeguarding Case Management Programme. This provides lead safeguarding officers and the safeguarding teams of sports with three distinct and discrete areas of support: initial advice upon the receipt of a referral, investigation support, and then hearing panels. There were 9 sports in the pilot, and that pilot was independently audited, and the results generally were that it was an absolute success, and those sports would be very sad if that support was taken away from them. I can tell you that by September, which I think is around 4 months away, we will be servicing 37 NGBs who will be availing themselves of that service. And that, in my view, is innovative and frankly groundbreaking. The second is the UK Sport funded programme, which is the Sport Integrity Line, where around 2,500 people who are in the high-class, world-class programme, high-performance system, are able to avail themselves of a confidential process to record concerns about bullying, harassment, discrimination, and so on. And the services that we will provide are to record that, to investigate that, and potentially provide mediation if both parties agree, and thereafter a hearing panel. We hear so often about athletes being unable or unwilling to raise their concerns. This programme will address that. And all credit has to go to UK Sport for having the vision to support that and to provide the funds for it to actually happen. But our main growth in the last few years has been international. We provide tribunals for the ARU, which is international athletics, for the ITIA, which is international tennis, and there are others. We've also set up the International Hearing Panel for the ITA, which services doping cases for non-Olympic and non-Paralympic sports, and I think it's 12 RADOs. In addition, we've provided ad hoc tribunal services for the World Athletic Championships in Doha, the Davis Cup, the Billie Jean King Cup, and we've actually signed an agreement to provide a comparable service for Commonwealth Games in Birmingham, and hopefully for future Commonwealth Games to come. I think that's quite impressive, but the only reason that we were able to do it is because of our panel members and our outstanding staff. We have nearly 300 panel members now, spread across the globe, covering 19 languages. When I started in 2010, there were 4 of us, and between us we could barely speak 1 language. With the 15th member of staff joining at the end of this month, we as an internal team will be able to speak 7 languages. That, on any view, is a significant movement forward, certainly from my time, and most certainly from 1997. So sincerely, I very much thank all of the panel members who provide their services on behalf of Sport Resolutions for all of the sports and agencies and bodies and NGBs and federations that I've indicated. Without your support, we simply could not do what we do. But lastly, I do want to pay a particular thanks to all of those on our pro bono panel. In 2012, we were invited by LOCOC to put together a pro bono list of lawyers who would be on call and available for every single day of the Games. That included a lawyer, an advocate, and a French-speaking lawyer, and we did that. As part of our legacy contribution to the Games, we decided to continue that, but it has grown significantly since then. And all of those individuals, law firms and barristers' chambers on that panel agreed to assist respondents on any matter that we administer for nothing. That is a significant undertaking and a significant contribution to the running of both British sport and international sport. And to put that into context, over 80% of the respondents who have been charged by UCAD domestically receive support from the pro bono panel, and it's over 40% of our international doping cases receive a similar level of support. So all in all, hopefully you can see that from humble beginnings we've come some significant way, culminating in events such as today. So thank you for indulging me for giving you a public history of sport resolutions. I'm told I don't do it often enough, so I've taken this opportunity to do so today. But all it remains for me to do is to thank you very much for coming. It really is a pleasure to see you all in person, and I really hope you enjoyed today's conference. So thank you.
It's hard, and you just wanna leave. I ain't never too far. Just have faith in me. Nothing's you heard. I can't believe, or I'll be standing by your side. Just have faith in me.
Figure skater tested positive for a banned substance just weeks before performing this week in Beijing. Heart medication that can increase endurance was found in the 15-year-old's sample on Christmas Day of last year.
The CAS panel in charge of this matter has decided to let Ms. Valieva continue her participation in the Olympic Winter Games Beijing 2022.
Okay, because she now is blaming the International Olympic Committee for its decision, saying it's a double standard that they're allowing Camila to compete. So if you recall, Sha'Carri was disqualified from competing in the Summer Olympics in Tokyo after testing positive for marijuana during the trials. Sha'Carri tweeted, "Can we get a solid answer on the difference of her situation and mine? My mother died and I can't run," and was also favored to place in the top 3. The only difference is I'm a black young lady.
Welcome up to the stage Katie Sterling from the International Tennis Integrity Unit, Christopher Quinlan QC, Dominic LaRue Lacroix from the International Testing Agency, and Jeff Benz. A round of applause, please. Welcome to all of you. As I mentioned, it's a big topic. This the 2021 World Anti-Doping Code. This, of course, is the overarching document for anti-doping practices worldwide.
When it was created, I mean, it was something that was never supposed to stand still, and these changes were introduced at the beginning of last year. The discussion today will really be, are they being implemented properly, are they fit for purpose? And it was interesting, I don't know how much you saw that video there, a lot of focus had been on, well, we'll kick things off with this, the protected person's definition, how that has changed and how much that has been at the fore in recent months. Valieva featuring heavily there, you saw that tweet, she was 15 years old, and now this definition of a protected person. Katie, I want to talk to you first because I know you deal with a lot of young people within your work in tennis. How do you feel about the code?
So in tennis, it's really important. It's a really big change which will impact us a lot, possibly a lot more than other sports. So there's not a huge number of sports where we're testing 14, 15, 16-year-olds on a regular basis. And so it's really important for us that there are those protections and we ensure that we're looking after those players. And for us, one of the most important things is when we've got these young players, it's making sure that the support personnel, the people around them that are meant to be supporting them, are taking at least some of the responsibility for that education, that doping knowledge and that awareness. And so the buck doesn't just stop with that very, very young player. It goes further than that, basically. Parents, coaches, medics, whoever's around them.
Dominic, you're nodding there. In your experience, I mean, you were obviously involved in this case with the IRC. How did you feel it was found out, and where are the rules applied?
Tough question. Well, I think I'll say, that it was a bit of Murphy's Law in this case, in the sense that it was a combination of factors that are hopefully unprecedented. The fact that the result was reported late, that definitely played in, and to happen during the games was something else. I'll kick it to Jeff afterwards to comment on that, but I think it didn't set a precedent and didn't change the code per se. I think it was very fact specific. I think we need to take into consideration, the game's time effect, having to take a decision under the gun with such high stakes. I think also we have to be humble about the fact that the code is only 20 years old, evolves every 5 years. I remember when we were trying to find precedents while preparing the case, there's none. There's none at least at the CAS level. And ultimately, maybe not from a legal perspective, I think we all felt that it's the most coveted event, it's high stakes, and she was a kid. Should kids be held, in such place for all the reasons, around this? So I think from that perspective, there's broader questions to be asked than just strict application of the legal concepts.
I think we should bring Jeff in at that point. Jeff is one of 3 judges who'd been selected to hear that case. Obviously a very difficult situation. I know there's only so much you can comment at this stage, but an unusual experience, I'm sure.
So much for my condition of participation that I wouldn't talk about the value. It was very much a high pressure situation for I think all of us on the ad hoc division of the games to address and deal with. But if you read the decision, which a lot of members of the media did not appear to do based on their reporting, you'll see that the case is one about due process and natural justice. It's not about did she cheat, did she take a prohibited substance. I think it's more about was it fair that she was called upon because of a failure of the lab to report out and failure of her anti-doping agency, which has its own separate problems, to report out and put her into the context of having to defend the merits of a doping lawsuit in the middle of the Olympic Games. And that's kind of at the heart of the decision. I was fortunate to be at the performance that just showed up on the video there, and figure skating was the sport that I was an elite athlete in as a youth. And I'd say that she's quite a skater, although at the end in the women's singles event, she kind of took care of herself in terms of avoiding any more kerfuffles about the medals and things like that by somehow figuring out how to place exactly 4th overall in the event, thereby taking away sort of the pressure that was on the event. But don't know what else I can say. I mean, it was a hearing that was well attended. Everybody and their brother appeared to want to be involved in the hearing as a lawyer. And I think if you look at the list, it was, and sisters, it was a list of about 35 lawyers appearing remotely at the hearing. We started at around 8 p.m. in Beijing on a Sunday evening, I think it was. And we finished at around 3:30, 4 in the morning, deliberated for another hour and a half plus, maybe 2, came back at it the next morning, a couple hours later, deliberated for a few more hours. And the decision issued shortly after that, which has been, I think, widely misunderstood. But that's what it is, and you can read about it.
Chris, you watched it, you read about it, what was your view?
Well, at the risk of widely misunderstanding, Jeff, the decision which I've read more than once, Ms. Vanier was the first female skater to perform a quadruple jump in the Olympics. Some might say, reading that beautifully crafted decision, that the judges were the next people to perform a quadruple jump interpretation. It was a wonderful piece of legal work. And there's a line towards the end of the decision, starting one of the final paragraphs. What we are not doing is rewriting the code. This is an exercise in interpretation. Some might wonder whether it was in fact an exercise in interpretation, rewriting the test that she had to satisfy in order to have the provisional suspended lifted. There's another point really about the decision though, and it's this, that one of the factors that was said to be important was that if she was not permitted to compete, it would cause irreparable damage. And then we saw the performance, didn't we? And we wonder whether, in fact, competing in that environment may have caused her irreparable damage and harm. Not physical, but psychological, to compete on the world stage at the highest level under that sort of pressure. And one does always have to remember that you're dealing with a child here. The pressure on elite athletes is immense, and pressure on children, so much more so.
What do you think then we learned from this case, if anything? Dominic, I wanted that one to you actually.
Well, I think, from an anti-doping organization perspective that and I agree in the decision where, it was put that, there's a strict liability for athletes, but it's also a strict liability on organizations to do the best and, to comply with the rules. So in terms of, from an operational standpoint, to make sure that, especially for the games, everything is dealt with in advance. And I think that was a huge factor in the decision of, being placed in this situation during the games when it had been pending for 2 months. So I think lesson learned here. And it's something, that didn't caught the eye, but this case happened on 4 occasions in the Tokyo Games. But didn't get the same traction, or the athlete did not challenge the provisional suspension. So it's really for anti-doping organizations to make sure that they play their part and put, the measures in place to make sure that this, very, human factor of just having delays because of, natural consequences just is taken care of. And then I think the broader question that has been, put forward by the IOC is, is there an age limit for the games? And that's I think a very interesting one, and that is for me one of the key lessons.
Could I come in on that? Because it's not a coincidence, is it, that this week the International Skating Union as an action is reviewing the age, the minimum age.
17.
Exactly so, and that can't be a coincidence. And I think that chimes with what people witnessed both on the ice and off the ice.
Well, funny, we were discussing this earlier, and Kate, that this, it addresses this definition of what a protected person is, but it doesn't actually, for Valieva, she's an elite athlete, so she is still not a protected person, so it's still slightly uncomfortable, isn't it?
So my understanding is once you've completed at an international event, you therefore lose that protected person, that junior status. And I think for us, the consideration is, yes, we do want to, look after the welfare of those younger athletes, but when so many of them start competing at such a young age on the tours, it's really difficult. And in the case of Valieva and others, maybe the IOC decision seems like it would maybe protect athletes coming through, but I can't see that she would necessarily get the benefit of that protection.
It's an interesting case. Do you know what? It's one that we could spend the next 45 minutes, but we'll move on from that for now because we've got quite a bit to get through here. I mentioned this earlier on, the issue around recreational drug use. And this obviously applies to athletes who have been taking things. We're talking about marijuana and cocaine. We were discussing this a little earlier on, and whether or not this has an impact on the punishments that have been changed. Chris, you've obviously sat in a lot of tribunals. What did you make of this change? Is this a positive step?
I thought it was a welcome change, actually. You take marijuana, you take cocaine, heroin is included as well. Very rarely is it that those are taken in competition and linked to sport performance. So the sanction, the reduced sanction of 3 months in those circumstances, potentially down to a month, they only take the programme. It is welcome, actually, because I think it reflects the culpability and the sanctions proportionate to that which the athlete has done.
I suppose it's the time scales too in dealing with this. That's been a constant issue, I know for you. This is obviously much needed at this point. I mean, how much of time this saves before it goes to tribunals, before it gets to that stage. I mean, it is a game changer.
Yeah, I think being able to, how shall I put it, compromise the cases which are properly compromised without having to go through the process of the tribunal is also a welcome addition to development.
Dominic, you work with anti-doping at length. How do you feel about this? It's a strange one, isn't it? Because it's kind of the decision was sort of taken because it's kind of dealing with what athletes do in their spare time. It should effectively improve their performance, and really should sports and sporting bodies be the people that tell people off for doing bad things. But I mean, where's the line?
Yeah, I agree with, and I fully agree with Chris that it was a positive change in the sense there's a tension in the code where what are we doing in anti-doping? We're also promoting and protecting the health. This was, upheld at the European Human Rights Court to really say that this is a guiding principle of anti-doping, is promoting health. So I think there's always been a tension between, what is recreational drug doing here? But at the same time, when you look at sanctions, you have cases prior, in business for more than a decade, that just didn't make sense. Having a 2-year or 4-year ban for someone who did drugs that were totally unrelated to sports performance, really had harsh consequences. So I do think it was quite a leap, and tried to resolve this sanction, tension of just not saying that it's, okay to take banned substances, which may be relevant, in some occasions, but I think rarely. But on the other side, still, addressing it and trying to play a role, and that's where from an operational standpoint nowadays, it means that we need to sanction and recognize rehab programs, which is a bit odd in your practice. What are we doing here? I'm saying that this 12-step program is compliant, which is a bit odd to be doing when you're really just prosecuting, but it also, I believe, makes sense in a broader scheme of things that we're trying to protect the athlete. We're not just against athletes. So it was a very novel and welcome initiative. Then is there some fine-tunings to be brought? I think that's the general concept, but we've applied it ahead of the games, where in the past we would have prevented athletes from going at the games because of cannabis positive, while now we were able to do something that was fair, appropriate, and hopefully also assist the athlete. Well, I think that we have to be, again, humble in what lawyers can do on helping on the rehab program.
It's not a default position either, because of course there are certain factors that the athlete has to satisfy out of competition, not until it's to enhance sporting performance. So, and there's still the provision in the code to sanction those to much longer periods, 2 or 4 years, if those things are required.
So those of us that were around at the beginning of this whole structure, I was general counsel of the U.S. Olympic Committee in 2001 when the first prohibited list came out. These recreational drugs are on the list because the U.S. government refused to pay its share of the WADA money, which was being met dollar for dollar by the IOC at the time. It came down to money. I wrote scores of letters to our drug czar's office in the White House telling them this is stupid, it's a waste of time, it doesn't enhance performance, you're never going to find an athlete with heroin that will enhance performance. I have yet to have the heroin case that I've sat on. And the like, and their position was one of social policy in the U.S. and the war on drugs in the U.S. which was mainly awarded directly to the southern borders of the United States. Things like that. And it got on the list then, and it stayed there even until now. But now we see this, I think, more positive approach that reflects a lot of what's happened in the American pro sports and how they've dealt with this. In fact, I think now the UFC and all of the pro leagues in the U.S. have taken the recreational drugs completely off the prohibited list, and you get diverted into another sort of social welfare program or rehab type program or things like that, but you don't get suspended and the like. So I don't get to make policy anymore. I don't get to have a voice in that. I only get to apply it. But it seems to me that perhaps we're not too far away from this coming out of the competition use as well. It's such an expense, I think, administratively for the system to have to manage this with no real gain on leveling the playing field in sport.
And if you could change something about this, what would it be?
About this
yeah, you said there, I mean, Tony said, that there's still work to be done, still some tweaks. What are the tweaks, do you think?
I mean, I think they should have a look at, after an application of this now, have a look at the competition part and see whether it makes sense to even have it on the list in any way like this, and maybe they get moved into a different route or a different approach, or maybe it becomes a multiple use issue where if you get caught doing it multiple times, you end up with an anti-doping rule violation. But I don't know. I mean, I've had my share of marijuana and cocaine cases that come in front of me, and they generally didn't strike me as the case of the cheater. They were the case of somebody that made a mistake. Athletes for a time had to figure it out with some precision based on the testimony they've given in front of me as to exactly what the half-life of marijuana might be in their system over time. And there's studies that said it was 29 days in a normal human sample, and some of these people have gotten it down to 10, 11, 12 days based on when they get tested. But why? Why do we put people through that for something that's not complete?
We saw when this was introduced, it was retrospective as well, so a lot of athletes who thought they'd be banned for another months and years in some instances, and suddenly they were allowed to compete again. It's incredible. There's still something though about this just doesn't seem. I mentioned tweaks, it just doesn't sit right. When you think, if you've got a tennis player and you see him lighting up a joint and we're playing tennis, well, where's the line here? Where do we kind of go? No, where are we responsible for this?
I think it is a really difficult one, especially in sports that have got a big following. There's potentially the reputation for the sport. There's the fans that might follow, and you sort of you're watching your sports hero doing drugs essentially. From the anti-doping organisation, the governing body side, as Jeff was saying, it's a really positive change in terms of resources. That lots of these cases can be dealt with quickly. We can be supporting the welfare of the athletes, helping them tackle any mental health issues that they might have through going through these rehabilitation programs. But I agree, it is a really difficult one because you are essentially taking drugs in some countries that's illegal. There is all that side of it as well, which what I think the code does want to seem to be doing is saying that that's okay. And I think that's where the possible slight difficulty is there.
Yeah, there is that feeling, isn't it, right? Like as mentioned. Chris, for you, where does the line sit for you legally when this is kind of one body is saying it's not our problem, essentially, that's for the legal system to deal with. As far as we're concerned, work away, or is it simple?
Well, it is, of course, in England, a Welsh criminal offence of possession of cocaine and heroin and cannabis. Cocaine and heroin are class A drugs, are serious drugs to be taken, and you shouldn't be taking them, should you, and competing in sport. It's misconduct for a start.
So then where is that line, in terms of the code, if we're saying that the code is allowing for this?
Doesn't what the code do now reflect the culpability so far as doping in sport is concerned, so it enables a panel, where appropriate, to impose a sanction which is not draconian, in other words 2 or 4 years, but instead 3 months, which is more in line to the sort of sentence you might expect in the Welsh possession of drugs, perhaps relatively more than that.
Jeff, do you wish that this had been introduced a few years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Did you have a hard time?
Well, I wish it would have been introduced from the beginning, but people didn't have the experience, and people had thought about coming up with an approach like this to do it. I mean, I'll say, for example, in the U.S., more than half the states have legalized the buying and selling of marijuana. The District of Columbia as well. You can buy and sell marijuana just outside the doors of the White House and the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. It's perfectly legal. It funds schools. It funds the public education system in the United States and many states. And it's not viewed with the same sort of negative view that it had in even 2001 in the US. Cocaine and the harder drugs that we use are a little bit of a different story, and I don't see those becoming socially acceptable.
I'd like to talk about the protection of whistleblowers. I mean, I do feel like from the media's point of view, it's something that, we talk about the whistleblower and the impact of this kind of sport, but up until now, are they fully protected? I know from the people I've spoken to that they haven't. So we're clear what the code actually states on this, that this new rule will give more protection and advise if someone is threatened or intimidated in order to discourage them from reporting doping activity or they are retaliated against for doing so, and this can carry a lifetime ban for sport. Dominic, this is obviously a positive step forward.
It is, of course. I mean, we've seen it in recent history that whistleblowing is what helps anti-doping organizations put the finger on actual doping practices and go way beyond than just normal, simple cases. So absolutely, they need to be encouraged, and it's key. I must, however, say that I don't think it's an issue of the code, but just in practice, it's difficult to implement. I personally have not implemented it or applied it just because it's a matter of evidence. Because it's a bit like the snake biting its tail, because eventually the athlete or whistleblower will need to testify. And in practice, it's very difficult then to protect this athlete, because at this stage, it's difficult to bring a case forward saying that often the source or the whistleblower wants to remain confidential because they don't want to stir the pot and be victims of the ones on whom they're reporting. So we're having a lot of the International Testing Agency. We opened up a secure platform. It's encrypted. We do a lot of advocacy. We reach out. We have hundreds of people talking to us, reporting. However, when we go into the realm of what can you do to protect you, and it entails giving a witness statement, because we still need to prosecute the person and say what are the facts, even if we're trying to hide away. Of course, this person will identify the whistleblower. There's a chilling effect there. There's a chilling effect because it means an actual case, and it's comparable to criminal offenses that when the rape victim has to go forward. It's the comparable experience there. So I do think it's encouraging. I do think it opened up the appetite or the willingness to say, okay, I'll be protected. However, in practice, it seems that it's not an anti-doping issue, but more an evidence issue, where it might be difficult to actually enforce. We would be looking at having an anonymized witness, but obviously the perpetrator would be identifying this person. And what can we do to actually protect this person that's beyond legal the legal cases?
Chris, you were nodding that.
I think we have to be imaginative about it. I agree exactly what Dominic said. It's really a matter of evidence, but you can prosecute very serious crime on the basis of anonymous witness statements and anonymous witnesses. And I think we have to be imaginative about how we get that evidence before panels. And anonymity is one way forward, so long as it does not result in an unfair process as far as the athlete is concerned. I think it's absolutely imperative, because this is the way you get to those who are trafficking, administering drugs, the higher up the chain. Not those who are testing positive. The science experts do that, but it's the evidence gathering. So we get those who are peddling the substances. But this is so important.
Do you feel that whistleblowers are protected?
I think it's a really difficult one, and I think it will take some time for this addition to the code to come through and to see that evidence. The ITI, this other one deals with corruption, and we rely on players making reports if they receive a corrupt approach, and that's sort of how we get to the bottom of lots of the corruption cases. And I think there needs to be that education. It needs to weave into that as well. That if players or athletes do see drug taking, trafficking, administering going on, they need to have safe and secure pathways that they can report those instances. I still, despite those protections written in the code, I fail to see that this will make everyone feel totally safe and confident in reporting those doping offences. I think it will take a while to come through and to see that effect.
It's brilliant, isn't it? You know, you said chilling was your word, unsafe. It feels like we're making progress, but not terribly quickly. Consider definitely how important and crucial. You mentioned evidence there, which is related to these sort of cases.
Well, I mean, the thing that strikes me about this is the jury's probably still out on what whistleblowing means in the context of anti-doping. And I do a lot of employment cases as an arbitrator and mediator in the U.S. And a couple things are certain. One is whistleblowers are zealots; they believe in their cause. But it's a fine line often between complaining and whistleblowing. And when you complain, maybe you don't get access to protections. But when you whistleblow, you do. And it's often a fine line between breach of other duties you have to other people when you take confidential information of some kind and you report it to somebody else. Even if it might seem obvious to you that there's something bad going on here that constitutes it. So I think it's an area that will be interesting to watch develop over time. I don't think as arbitrators in these cases we have a great amount of difficulty with taking evidence in different or creative forms. It's been done in match fixing cases for a very long time to have anonymized witness presentations, just as it's done here in the courts of England and Wales and criminal cases and other kinds of cases. And there's creative ways to approach that. So I don't see that as a particular problem, but I think that all of this needs to sort of percolate a bit and be worked out before we get a sense of whether this has worked or not and whether there are other ways to provide protection.
And in terms of when you said that we're looking at a time when this was introduced at the beginning of last year, have we seen this applied anywhere? I mean, is there a case that we can think of that, that demonstrates that the code is being applied correctly? I can't, to be honest.
Not to mind, well, I'd say we represent 60 international federations and we haven't, but I think the difference or the positive side is, with the good governance restructuring, such as in tennis, athletics, and integrity units, at least now people know that they can report to a body that will listen to them, that will use the information in confidence if it needs to stay, and that's already mighty helpful on on our testing, on our strategy, on understanding the landscape, and they know that they can talk to us versus maybe a prior years ago. Maybe international federations, for a lot of reasons, were not as trustworthy or well equipped, to hear them out, because often they have, personal issues, and they're in a difficult situation, and they need to have, competent, skillful professionals to, hear them out and try to assist them as much as they can, even if it doesn't culminate in an actual case or a sanction against someone else. It's still, they know they can talk to someone, and the information will be used and they will be assisted as much as we can.
Another area I mentioned earlier on as well is changing to existing ADRBs. Again, attempted complicity, we're talking the attempted involvement or cover up of an ADRB committed by another person has been added. The sanction length can vary between 2 years and a lifetime ban. We talk about tampering as well. I mean, this is, we know our lessons have been learned here, but the enemy has something to say on it.
Well, tampering, I think those cases are very interesting because they come in all shapes and forms. Usually it's through intelligence work, whistleblowing included, and just having clarified, there's the new code has clarified examples that came from case law of what it means to tamper, because the definition is very broad, so that's definitely useful. And just to have added, because often if you did a good job, you interrupted the tamper, and it's only just an attempt, and so to have clarified that it can still be prosecuted. It's supposed to be intent, and it's just the crime was not fully perpetrated, but it was there. So that's definitely a positive clarification that we brought in the book.
And we get on to this, we've not sort of mentioned the elephant in the room in terms of Russia and the McLaren report and eyebrows. How can this code be applied when you have cases, like Russia, which does sort of seem where they don't apply the rules and yet they're competing under a different guise. I mean, it's sort of hard to understand why create this code, why create these rules if they won't be applied in certain circumstances. Chris?
Well, isn't that the point that Ms. Richardson was making when she was complaining bitterly that because she'd spoken, what if you're at my age, you might call a joint, you find yourself not being able to go to the Olympic Games, and yet in other circumstances, an athlete who's taken, on the face of it, tested positive rather for a substance, in respect to which she might have been subject to a mandatory provisional suspension, is able to compete. That was the point she was making in her own way, is that if you don't apply the code consistently across the piece, then some people are going to suffer injustice.
Injustice, that's really what we're talking about here. That's kind of how it has seemed to play out in the past.
Well, no, I was interrupting you, but Jeff's version of justice may be different from my version of justice, but we both ought to be able to read the code in a way which is consistent and apply it consistently. And athletes are entitled to be able to predict some certainty what the outcome of a particular case is going to be.
Should the code be interpretive?
Well, all law is interpretive legislation, but the question, I suppose, is how imaginative you are.
Definitely imaginative.
There are some lawyers in the room where they would that was the version of that. But I think that for me, the real issue seems to be enforcement and auditing, and pushing everybody to make sure they're in compliance. Doesn't matter who you are. And I know resources, in the end, they'll be movement are limited. But if you have what appears to have been the case, an entire nation not enforcing the rules the way they're supposed to be enforced or applied, where does the buck stop on making sure that gets done? And I question that why isn't this an administrative problem and an enforcement problem as opposed to one that's a judicial or arbitration related problem or a legal problem per se. So I put that out there for thoughts.
Well, I agree. I mean, you might say, well, if you wish to be provocative, of course I do. But to respond to your invitation, Holly, you might say, well, doesn't actually responsibility lie much higher up the chain than I'm a subject the likes of you and me, and with the government bodies, the international federations. I mean, if you take the view that there's been egregious anti-doping by Russian athletes, then you might expect an international federation, or dare I say it, an Olympic Commission to say, well, actually, you can't compete at all. That's the sanction. Until you put your house in order, your athletes under whatever flag can't compete.
Why do you think, loaded question, why do you think that hasn't happened?
Well, that may be high or low politics, Holly, which is beyond me.
Dominic, I'd like to ask you, just, I know that you're independent on this, but where do we go from here then in terms of trying to talk about this code? There's no point sitting here discussing this if it's not applied correctly, and we've seen this in the past.
Well, I think first is, to answer the question on conflict of interest. I think it's about, also putting the code in the hands of people who do not have conflict of interest. It's very difficult to, without accusing anyone, if, an international federation has to apply the code, and as you said, it's difficult when you have to apply it to yourself if you're the official, the president. And I mean, we've seen stark examples of this with recent integrity units doing the right thing just because applying the code when you're not biased is very easy. It's very easy to go for tempering against presidents or officials when it's not your boss and it's just your job, in fact. So I think that's where we go for it. A lot of the issues, and we've seen it. The IFA, we dealt with the weightlifting federation. They had a decade of skeletons in the closet, and they culminated and landed on the IFA's desk. And I mean, it was a prime example of just the rules were there, they were not enforced, and it was from a human's perspective. Once it was passed on to a body who its sole purpose is to implement the code, which is to vigorously pursue anti-doping rule violation. It was very quite simple, if I may say. So I think it's the rules, but also the ones who actually apply it.
Katie, in your experience then, kind of straightforward is it? I mean, have you ever found it as a conflict of interest?
Well, I think the issue here is that you've got a piece of, you've got the code, it's not black and white, there's so many grey areas, and it can try to be as objective as possible, but ultimately you are giving a lot of power to individuals to make, in the decision-making process. So there are hearings, and however objective you try to be, however strictly you try to apply the code, there is some subjectivity inherent in that, and so you are going to get different views and slightly different outcomes, and I think that I don't think we'll ever be in a position where you can iron out all of the grey areas. There will always be people who apply it in a slightly different, albeit in no ways incorrect, no ways correct. There will be differences there, and I think that's will be inherent in whatever form that the code ends up in.
It's funny, ultimately we want to answer the question of whether the code is effective, whether it's being applied properly, but everything feels grey, I think it's fair to say. No, ultimately, but I don't think that, from what you're telling me, it's ever possible. I mean, is that fair, that we can never create a code that can be applied effectively and it is ultimately correct? I know it changes all the time.
I don't think it's not being applied effectively. I think that it's very difficult to apply it completely consistently in every different case. So I'm not saying that any decision is ineffective or isn't following the code, but I would say, in my opinion, it's nigh on impossible to get it completely consistent across the board. Others may disagree, but...
I thought how you measure it. How do you measure success? How do you measure consistency? You ought to be able to measure consistency by two similar cases arriving at a similar conclusion. But that's not difficult. What's more at issue is the higher bodies not taking decisions. So like, for example, Russia, and like what has been proved to have happened in Russia, that sort of thing leaves an indelible stain on sport, doesn't it? Because the higher bodies, by which I mean not the arbitral panels, but the are not making decisions that many people think we should make. That's not a code issue, is it? That's a different issue.
When you stay on sports, I think a lot of people would agree with you when it comes to Russia that we have a lot of facts. I think, Jeff, from your experience, it's a difficult one to deal with. I'm very interested to get your opinion on that in terms of how we deal with the Russia problem. Is it a problem from your point of view?
I think that there are a lot of people that have been disappointed by the arbitration process and how it affected the Russian outcome. I had nothing to do with any of those cases. But I come back to this issue of somebody in a better decision-making position than me, higher up the food chain, needs to be taking responsibility for making sure that countries and their anti-doping agencies follow the rules the way they're supposed to do it. And if that means empowering WADA to do it, if that means putting more money toward the process to do it, and the like, I think that would be a good start overall. And we all can point to the obvious issues, but there are other countries that have issues that I think we know about that aren't subject to the same level of scrutiny as Russia has been. Russia maybe deserved this level of scrutiny. But having a system that doesn't have an enforcement mechanism in place to make sure that at least everybody's following some basic modicum of the same rules doesn't make any sense to me. And it's not going to get solved by arbitrators, it's going to get solved by policymakers.
Yeah.
So is that a fair point then, that maybe WADA needs to have more investment, as you say, and more power?
If it's them or if it's the IOC, they control access to the event that most of these IFs want to be part of, or I don't know who it is, but it's somebody else other than people at my level or even at, I think, the IF level. They can only have jurisdiction over their sport.
It's frustrating, isn't it, when there's only so much power with this thing that we can have. But yes, Dominic, would you agree with that? Is there more power needed up above?
100%, and I think we all saw the void, when the Russian scandal hit. There was WADA didn't have, the rules to actually sanction properly Russia. They had to create a whole standard, compliance standard. Again, I think we have to be, looking back, and it was just unexpected that an anti-doping organization would not play its part to the contrary. So they looked at the code, and in fact, it was just it was not foreseen, so they had to go to the drawing board and look at rules. And since then it's 5 years ago. 5 years ago is nothing. So definitely it's about, empowering, the watchdog, giving is it water, of course it's water, more resources and actually the mechanism to, compel the anti-doping organization and to properly monitor. Code compliance in 2013, from audit perspective, was checking whether an anti-doping organization had implemented rules. That's nothing. I mean, it was already a big effort if you think about, that just the fact that anti-doping organization actually adopted the code, but they were not looking into the actual implementation. This only came 2016, 17. These are, I'm laughing about it, but it's not really funny in the sense that there's so much more to do. A couple of years ago, you could, have rules on your website, do a couple of tests, and be done with it. Which is definitely, history has shown that, except, if everybody's in good faith, that, that's not really what's happening, or it's not just good faith, but it's also about being competent, hiring the proper team and proper person. So I think it's definitely only by empowering and being maybe less naive and giving the tools for, the actual, monitoring and governing bodies to put in, the structure and then have teeth to sanction.
And to that point, the World Athletics got ahead of this in 2000. They had everybody, I think, in 2016. I had a case involving 60-some Russian athletes that ended up being excluded from the Rio Games. But that was because World Athletics had a rule that the arbitrators were able to apply to deal with the specific facts and circumstances of that case. And that's where we come in. But we don't, if you don't have the rule there, if you don't have the system in place to make sure that the rules being complied with, don't come looking at the cast. It's not going to be able to help.
With that in mind, we're talking then about putting this to higher bodies here, but with the code, is there anything that has been missed, anything that is downright wrong that needs to be improved that you look at and go, well here, why are we not talking about that? I don't know. It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. They're absolutely across it.
I think the intention thing is still being figured out.
Yeah.
I think that you have very difficult cases where athletes seemingly might be innocent, but they're not able to prove source.
Okay.
And those cases get harsh results because the rules say what they say about that. I don't have any great policy suggestions on how to rewrite that rule or to make it better, but one of the things that they did in this code was they ameliorate a sanction if you come forward, I think, within 20 days and you fess up, you can get a year taken off the floor.
Yeah.
Well, if you're an athlete who's tested positive for something, you have no idea where it came from, and you have nothing to fess up to, and you have nobody to turn in to get substantial assistance. Why is it that you're getting 4 years pretty much automatically, and this person that's actually made cheated is getting 3? So there are things, effects like that I think need to be worked out a little bit. It's a tough case for the arbitrators. We are all human. We think about the impact of our decisions and the facts in front of us. And there are cases where you're pretty sure somebody's a cheater, and there are cases where you're not so sure they're anything more than a knucklehead. And if intention is the right way or not, I think remains to be seen. But I'm stuck applying the rules that they'll put in front of me as an arbitrator. I do that.
With that in mind, is there enough common sense, do you think, applied sometimes? If it's as straightforward as that, you know when right and wrong is taking place? Does it deal with that?
There's loads of common sense in hearings, Ollie. Arbitrators are full of common sense. I agree with Jeff actually on the intention point. I mean, it's such a convoluted definition of intention, which imports the concept of recklessness as well, knowing risk taking. It's very difficult, and I wonder whether actually an answer, maybe not the answer, is some greater flexibility when it comes to sanction. I understand why there isn't, because consistency of approach and consistency of sanction. But a lot of the time we spend ourselves, spending hours dealing with evidence, and dealing with whether it's intentional or not, and the source of the substance, which many athletes simply cannot establish, because everyone's conscious that the element in the room, if you like, is 4 years or 2 years, and we instinctively often think that's just too much. That's just too much.
In an athlete's career, it's
well, That's the other thing, of course, you're absolutely right. So if you have a 10-year career as an athlete, then in what sport it is, and they will be the end of it, because you've got to come back and all the rest of it. That isn't to say that those who cheat, properly so called, deserve every day, some might say, of their sanction. But those who are not cheats, or may not be cheats, then it can be harsh. One of the most difficult cases I've ever had to do was one of the first cases I did as an arbitrator, with a young man in South Wales who had realised his ambition in his young life to play for his local rugby club, which was a decent standard rugby. And his case was that he must have taken, because he tested positive, a supplement that was contaminated, but he had no way at all of proving that. And this 21-year-old lad, if that's what he was around that sort of age, was looking down the barrel of 2 years. And if he had made a mistake, if he had taken it deliberately, which I was far from sure that he had, or he probably had, then that's tough. That really is tough. And you with no flexibility. I mean, when I was being intellectually honest about this, there was just no flexibility in that case. But it's tricky because, as Jeff says, most lawyers are human, and we look at people in the room, and you're not always surrounded by cheats. Some people have just been unlucky. On the other hand, if you're a clean athlete and you're deprived of the opportunity of meddling, then I can only begin to imagine what must be like.
There was a laugh there from most lawyers would be right.
Katie, sorry, I was just going to say to your point, I think what's very difficult there on the sort of the proving source, athletes have such different resources, and you're then totally dependent on basically how much money you can throw at the problem. And there might be some athletes who can afford to test one or two supplements, or they can afford lawyers for 10 hours. And there might be some athletes who can throw everything at the kitchen sink of it. And there's a fairness there, isn't there, between if you're a very high-profile athlete with huge amounts of funding behind you, you're in a very different position to an athlete who is, maybe is working 3 jobs alongside their sporting career. And I think that element of fairness is quite difficult as well.
That's what it comes down to then, actually. When you've got an athlete like that, you can throw all the resources at it. I mean, in your experience, they're the ones that are successful.
Well,
they're more likely to find the source of the bad things.
And they're also more likely to have representation and lots of it. And they are also much better able to take every single point and to exhaust the ADO, or the International Federation, and bring the allegations. And there is an imbalance here, actually. And one of the things about the new code is recognising the difference, for example, between a recreational athlete and an elite athlete, which is a good development, as far as I'm concerned. But there's a real imbalance between the young lad that I spoke of in South Wales, who no resources at all, apart from his mother, and the multi-millionaire sportsmen who arrive with, a battalion of lawyers, more expert witnesses than you can shake a stick at, and they've exhausted their opponents before the hearing even starts.
But I think beyond, if we agree with what you said, but beyond that, and I don't have a solution, but it's not just the imbalance, it's also based on the concept of strict liability. That's the cornerstone of the code. I don't think we're in a position where we want to re-question it, but it does have, some outcomes which are clearly unfair. And it's just, setting the burden of proof is just so high for an athlete, regardless, of his resources. It's just the way that it is maybe a failure on, actually catching dopers. That's the reason why we have such a high, legal burden once we do have, detected a banned substance. But this is, really the prime principle of the code. It's a safeguard. It's often what we call a floodgate issue. If we started, to have, have the anti-doping organization to actually prove a case without this concept, I think it would be a very, steep hill to climb. And, it has also had, some success and some merits. And when you actually have just, a very nice EPO case for a cyclist where it feels right, to put an athlete to this standard, just to make sure that he doesn't get away, with such a case. But obviously, I think, and there's another point of, the science being so precise and being able to detect, really trace amounts of substance, and then, how do you translate that into facts? It's very difficult afterwards. You have I think it would be very difficult for arbitrators to, look at something that just, doesn't make sense. You're dealing with quantities of a bad substance that you don't know if it's from contamination, you don't know if it's, the tail end excretion of an intentional intake. Sometimes you just, it's a black, you have few pieces of the puzzles, and it's a very difficult call to do, but then the rules are very, clear and strict. I know from, my experience with discussing with the World Anti-Doping Agency is that they want to put this higher bar because they don't want anything to, it's a slippery slope otherwise, but it does sometimes have harsh effects on some individual cases where the facts just do not square with doping. And I think, a change of the 2021 code, which was not discussed a lot, was the fact that the word cheating was removed from the definition of intention, and now it's all about just the legal concept of, recklessness. And personally, I thought that the fact that the word cheating was included in 2015 code was relevant because it kind of gave you a guiding principle. It kind of helped you, identify, because technically speaking, someone who smokes cannabis knows that he's committing an anti-doping law violation, so technically speaking, you could say that this is intentional, because he's knowingly, taking a bad substance. But of course that doesn't make sense for all the reasons that we talked, a few minutes ago. So I think, from our perspective, often we try to, remind ourselves, what are we doing here? And it's about, a clean sport. It's about going after those who have breached the code, but, substantively, not just, on the technicality. But unfortunately, it is quite technical sometimes.
So yeah, a really interesting point that I haven't given much thought to that, the cheating has been taken out of this, but really hasn't gone away. Ladies and gentlemen, I would love to open this up to the floor. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I did tell you that I have a hashtag, and I've got absolutely technology on me, so that's good news. Are there any questions? Anyone would raise their hand, please? We'll do old fashioned way, can I? And then I'll wrap up. Any questions, please, ladies and gentlemen? I haven't seen very well. Now, you're not going to tell me a room full of journalists and lawyers about any questions for our esteemed panel here, are you? No questions at all. Could someone just be in case someone has not wanted to say it out loud? First of all, can you please give our panel a massive round of applause? That's fantastic. It's one of those topics I think we can all agree that it's not black and white. It's very, very grey. Which surprises me then that there are no questions here. I can see, the lights on. Any questions, ladies and gentlemen? No, I think we've answered all the questions then. 2 seconds, I'm just going to double check because I don't want to miss out in case somebody has quietly put it on Twitter. Isn't technology great? No, very good. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, please give our panel. No, we do have a question. Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
Thanks. You spoke about the potential age limit to be introduced into the Olympic Games as an answer to cases like Valieva. As a sports fan, as well as somebody who works in the industry, I found some of the stories of young athletes in the Games to be some of the most positive stories in the Games. And one like Sky Brown in skateboarding, who was 13 years old, I think, was a brilliant story. So I wonder whether an age limit is the right answer, and we might lose a lot of the magic of the Games by imposing one, and whether the panel have any ideas as to other potential solutions.
It's a really good point. We're working on it.
One of the side benefits is that the Youth Olympic Games now has a future, right? That was the games that the IOC put on that didn't really seem to have much of a purpose. It was Jacques Roch's baby when he was president. It wasn't clear what was going to happen with it. But this case has now started to talk about, well, we can make those games exciting by adding some people that might actually be the world's best into that format, and then we see them develop and come into the Olympic Games. I don't know if that's the answer or not. This is way above my pay grade as a policy decision, but the areas that are, the one area where people are prone to abuse is at this young age. And I think that you really have to question the entourage issue in the Valieva case. You really have to, somebody has to take a look at that, particularly given the conduct that happened at the ladies' finals event that was witnessed by millions of people on television around the world. And maybe that's a rough, cut at how to solve some of these issues, or maybe it's the right one.
What do you think? I mean, it's a difficult question because I suppose from your point of view in this panel, I mean, you're not too concerned about what headlines that we put in the back pages or on tech TV. It's really about athlete welfare for you.
It's a safeguarding issue, isn't it? It's what it is. I mean, I watched over the weekend a YouTube clip of Valieva's performance. And there's a wonderful line by the commentator at the end in which he says there's a lot of goodwill for her. Because if you have a 15-year-old and you're involved in an elite sport, they tend to do what they're told. And that, for me, just summarised the position that she no doubt found herself in. Whatever the merits of the case, having to go out and perform on the ice after what had happened was asking a lot of a child.
And that was the thing that we saw from the reaction, those words repeated over and over. She is a child.
Any other questions? Is there? Yes, one would like them to put up the microphone. Thank you.
I'd be interested to hear the panel's views on the introduction of the Rodchenko Act in the US, whether that, in their view, creates a parallel system, and if that has a concern for the application of the wider code. I'm aware that there's at least one prosecution ongoing in the US relying on that act, but interested in the panel's views.
I told Travis Tiger when he spoke in favor of it, it was the worst idea I thought I'd ever heard. Because from my perspective, what I can see it doing is shutting down anti-doping investigations. So if you're accused of a crime, you're not going to give your best evidence to the anti-doping people that can't put you in jail. You're going to save it if you have to trade it for something else to get a plea deal or something else out of a U.S. government entity that might prosecute you. So I also think it smacks of American, what's the right word? I mean, you guys all characterize us as you characterize us, but we shouldn't be regulating world sport with our own legislation. The long-arm jurisdiction of that statute, to me, doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And we have a history in our country of government non-interference in sport, for the most part. There's almost, outside of pro boxing and horse racing, which are regulated at the state level in the United States, there's almost no legislation that affects the conduct of sporting activity. Maybe a little bit affecting television antitrust and things like that. But so for me, I'm fairly clear in my view of it. I think it's stupid, and we'll see what future it brings. The first prosecution was some lower level person in the U.S. domestically that they chose to do something about it.
Sorry, go ahead. I think on mine, I quite agree with your sentiment there. However, I think the positive side is the fact that, in US we don't have police powers. And if there's good collaboration with law enforcement, and there's teeth there, and eventually, and I think this first example, will show and has shown, collaboration between law enforcement and the anti-doping organization. That's positive. That's positive because often we're facing a wall because we can't do search and seizures, we can't wiretap. So if there's a legislation, and it has been the case in Italy, for example, where there's great collaboration between law enforcement and anti-doping organization. It takes a bit more time. It might go in the pipeline of criminal offense for a while, but eventually it does land on the anti-doping organization's plate to prosecute, and it's just a tool that, if there's good collaboration between the organization, brings us, the police powers that we, desperately need. And I do think also on this first, case, it was interesting to see that it's also about tackling, the enablers who are not in the sport movement. A random doctor who is, doping athletes, but he is not attached to the IF world, and therefore there's no jurisdiction there. So I think that was a reassuring, if I may say, example.
Yeah, I had a case very recently where very important evidence against the athlete was the result of collaboration between law enforcement agencies in the US and the Athletics Integrity Unit. We managed to get hold of some from US Customs, some very important material, text messages and the like, which was absolutely damning, which the athletes had not given permission to have a fair example.
Very, very good question. So this is what I mean. We've got these incredible speakers here. Some more questions better. You're all alive now. Please, yes, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't microphone to you first. Thank you.
Thank you. Just thinking about the case, one aspect that perhaps we haven't spoken about is the entourage. I'm not thinking, asking you specifically to think about that case, but generally, do you think we've got enough in the code currently to deal with entourage, or is there more architecture that could be built into it?
I'll make you want to get things off on that one. I think we do. I think we do in the sense that it's a binding obligation for AUs to look into entourage as soon as the minor is involved. So, you know, and then if it's a compliance issue. So I think, you know, the mechanism is there to make sure that, you know, AUs are looking at it. I think, you know, the sanctioning is there, you know, complicity, all the rules are there. Then I think it's a matter of evidence. That's where, you know, in law enforcement, you know, compelling athletes to speak, having substantial assistance, the regime is there as well. I think, you know, let's say the framework is there, then it's about the actual implementation. And I, you know, fully believe that, especially for those cases, that's the crux of the matter. It's not, you know, the individual analytical result. Is about, you know, what happened in the background, and that's definitely, you know, something that, you know, the AUs need to look at in priority.
Certainly in tennis, that's the big thing that we're looking into. So when you've got these junior players, who is supporting them? Are their parents, are their coaches? Is the coach coaching a whole range of junior players? So just sort of looking how far that possible doping, that the crisis can spread. And so it's certainly something that we're trying to support the players, but also checking who is assisting that doping. As you say, a 14-year-old does what they're told. We referenced in the Valley case, so just looking wider than just the play.
It's something we discussed a little bit earlier on. You know, within elite sport, these athletes are getting younger and younger, and you know, we mentioned football as well earlier with the academies and things, and it's just about that support network around them. Jeff, I don't know how much you want to say on this issue of entourage, even not necessarily on the Valley case, but this is something that you've dealt with.
I mean, I've had entourage-related cases. And in the early days of it, there was a lot of question about how you get jurisdiction over some people that aren't otherwise within the elite sports system, like a doctor. Like a doctor who's, I never joined an NGB or I never joined an entity, but I think we've all figured out how to deal with those things. So I think that for minor athletes in particular, though, and in particular what I saw in Beijing, that the entourage effort and the entourage investigation and analysis generally is something that the anti-doping organizations need to take seriously.
Great, thank you. I'm going to say one more question if we have any to go to push for time. Like, way back, way back there. Go on ahead.
Thank you very much. I was fascinated to hear the panel discussion about recreational drug use earlier and about the scope or reach of the code in that respect. I wondered if they thought there was a parallel with one of the footnotes in the code about using anti-doping samples for investigation into eligibility for sex categories, particularly the female category in sport. So, you know, is that a parallel of another extent of the use of the code in something, in that case, something that isn't involving the use of a substance or method?
Yeah, did you know?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Sorry.
Sorry, so...
using the samples for different...
Yes, so the samples, the footnote that's in the code about that's been there since 2019, I believe, about the use of samples collected, not to look at drug use in that case for high testosterone, for example, but to use that then to investigations for individuals you know, sort of with DSD, for instance.
I think sort of that high pressurism discussion, if at all possible, I'd really like to leave that topic for the later in. I don't want to pass views on that. I know it's really controversial, so if you don't mind, I think there's a discussion on that later.
I would totally agree with that. We are going to have a Q&A a little later on, so I think it would be best to leave those questions till later. We have someone who's well equipped to discuss that. That's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, a huge round of applause to Katie Sterling, the Christopher
such a long, long, long time.